Man, I tell you what, everyone was super excited for 13. Really appreciate everyone's comments about just the playthrough in general. Everyone's really excited to see. I think what happened is a lot of people are like me, where they played this when it came out and then never again. So now they're kind of like, I wonder, you know, if it really was any good, or if it was just kind of a sign of the times. You know, people were just frustrated with this type of game, and this was just kind of the leading, I guess, kind of like the straw man of the community, and then going back on it now, it's actually not as bad as everyone thought it was. Or maybe it's even worse, and, you know, so people are just kind of curious to see it. I think we all kind of accepted that 13 was a thing, but have never really taken a super deep dive into it. Or you're one of those that are actually like a super massive fan of 13 and just excited to see me play through it. So it's kind of like two camps, but seems like everyone is at least interested to see it. Whether or not they like it or not, it's just going to be an interesting playthrough no matter what. Because it's interesting to see how this game aged. Because like I said, at the time, it was such a huge divisor of the community, you know? And someone said that someone said something about the futuristic setting. I think it's so interesting that this game has a futuristic setting, because it's so, it's such a great, like, metaphor for how it actually was in real life, too. Like, this was the modern Final Fantasy. This is what we were all dreading when Final Fantasy X came out, and we were like, I don't know, like, this game's really good, but we're starting to get into that realm of, like, future Final Fantasy. I want to go back to, like, Final Fantasy 9 and 8 and 7. I don't like this new, like, where's it going from here, you know? And then 12 came out, and it was like, okay, this is kind of a return to form. Like, we're back to that kind of old style, not medieval, but what do you call that? Like, I don't know what to call that era. Like, where it's not medieval per se, but it's like, it's not, 12 wasn't really steampunk though. Like, 9 was steampunk. 12 was like, I don't know. But was it really, well, I guess they did have like ships that shot lasers, so I guess 12 is just weird, okay? 12 is just a weird time period. Diesel punk or something, I don't know. Magi punk. But anyways, you know, that was at least, that felt a lot more Final Fantasy-ish. But then there was this game where it's like unapologetically futuristic, right? Futuristic with its gameplay, futuristic with its characters, futuristic with its world. It is unapologetically modern. And that was just like the tipping point for so many people. But now we can look back on it and be like, you know, it's its own thing. It's its own unique thing. And I think a lot of people looked at this game and thought this is the beginning of the end. Every Final Fantasy after this is going to be some futuristic, nonsensical, goofy thing, right? But then 14 came out, and then 15 came out, and we realized, like, oh, it's not just going to be, like, futuristic stories. Like, they can still go back to the old ways, right? So now we can kind of look at this as not the end of Final Fantasy as we know it, but more of just its own thing, right? So I think that helps, honestly, because I was the same way when this game came out. I enjoyed it, but I kind of felt like it was the beginning of the end. Like, at this point, Square has gone off the deep end, and they're just going to make super futuristic Star Wars stories forever, you know? You can't go back. Once you go here, you can't go back, but they proved us wrong, especially with 16. You know, they've really shown us that, like, they're willing to go back to basics, go back to, and I'm talking just with the story, but willing to go back to the crystal stories, willing to go back to medieval stories, willing to go back to that steampunk style if they want to. Like, they don't have to make futuristic stories just because 13 was. So that helps 13 a lot, honestly. I can look at this game as its own unique thing and not the beginning of the end for Square Enix. So, and even the gameplay, like, yes, 16 is definitely following in the footsteps of the linear, removing RPG elements and making it more about linear combat. But 14 was an MMO, and 15 was an open world game. So, you know, this wasn't a sign of Square Enix giving up on RPGs forever and turning Final Fantasy into an action game, you know. They have shown us that they're willing to do whatever they think is right to make a good game. So, I think that's definitely a big plus for going back to this game and realizing, hey, it's not the harbinger of death that we all thought it was. We can kind of just look at it as its own experience. Is it good? Is it bad? And not have to put it in this category of it ruined Final Fantasy. Because that's something I hear a lot. I mean, a lot. I hear I gave up on Final Fantasy at Final Fantasy X, and I hear I gave up on Final Fantasy at Final Fantasy XIII. More than anything else. There's some outliers, but it's always those two. It's either 10 or 13 is where people quit and said, you know, I'm no longer a Final Fantasy fan. I'm now a retro Final Fantasy fan. I am no longer a modern Final Fantasy fan. That's what was a lot of people's tipping point.
Just stay out of my way.
And now that we kind of see where Final Fantasy has gone, it's a bit of a shame because I think it is important to take each game individually. I heard a Windows noise. Are we all right? Can you still hear me? Am I alive? I think I am. What was that? I don't know what that was. Stop unplugging my stuff. Yeah, that was me. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about your computer. That was me. Yeah, there's two sides. There's people that are willing to just play each Final Fantasy game, and then there's people that are like, Final Fantasy is dead. And they won't even play, even if they like action games, they won't play 16 just off the premise that it's Final Fantasy, you know? Like, if Final Fantasy 16 was called anything else, they would enjoy it, but the fact that it's called Final Fantasy 16, they just can't get over the fact that it's not a turn-based RPG, it's not a Final Fantasy type game. So the fact that Final Fantasy's in the name ruins it for them, which is fair. I mean, it really is. I don't hold that opinion. I used to, kind of. Like, I felt that way when this game came out. I was like, if they go any further... I remember when this game came out, I was like, if they go any further than this, I'm done with Final Fantasy. And I like action games. But, like, calling it Final Fantasy and it being this action game with no RPG elements, like... that was the line for me. I was like, that's not a Final Fantasy game, you know, and I'm not going to support that. But as time's gone on, I realized that, like, we have over a decade of the retro Final Fantasy games. And this is Square Enix's flagship franchise. They want it to be whatever type of game is popular, they want to follow that. They don't want Final Fantasy to be stuck in this it has to be this type of game, you know? They want to branch out and make it different.
This whole place is crystal.
So I just take each game individually now, you know? But I get that frustration, I really do. I understand it. And I had it for a certain amount of time.
I wonder what it'd be like to become a crystal, I mean.
Cold.
You gonna complete your focus?
Maybe. If I knew what it was. Yeah, I probably don't want to know.
Hey, Lightning. Did Sarah say anything to you about her focus?
Didn't we have this discussion already?
Nothing.
You know what? She probably didn't want to worry you.
Or she just didn't think she could trust me.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm sure that was it. But yeah, you know, having said that, I do have this feeling, like especially with 16, where we are reaching a point where Final Fantasy is just words at the start of the game that get us to buy it. And we're rapidly approaching Final Fantasy not even being Final Fantasy anymore at all. Luckily, the story of 16 is very Final Fantasy, but that's about all it's got going for it in terms of being Final Fantasy-ish anymore. Which I can see how that would really frustrate some people. I guess I've come to realize too that like Final Fantasy has always been a series that is super different with every game. So it's just not that surprising that they would change up like even more as the years go on, you know? Final Fantasy was never a series that stood still. You know, and people like to say that the first 10 games were turn-based, but that was mostly because they had to be. They couldn't make this type of game in 1995, you know? Even if they wanted to, so... But yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see how the future goes, because saying that Final Fantasy XIX will be an FPS, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I mean, they did make a third-person shooter Final Fantasy game. At least that was a side game, though. Like, I would ask you guys, what would be the limit for you? Like, what type of game would they have to make for you to just be like, yeah, I'm out? But honestly, a lot of people are already out. So I don't know if that's really a good question to ask. For those of you that are still in, what type of game would they have to make for you to be completely out? Because at least 16 does have RPG elements, even if they're the most bare bones RPG elements I've ever seen.
I think I recognize it from somewhere.
At least they still exist. Where would we have to go where just everyone would be out? They make like a sports game? They make a dating sim? Didn't they already do that? Tetris game? Mobile idle game? Oh, hold on to your butts, because that's coming. What if it was a blitzball game? Would that still be good?
Wanna stop for a minute?
Yeah, you know, that's a really good point. Like, what about people that got into the series late, you know? People that have been around since Final Fantasy V, they have many years of turn-based RPGs, and then suddenly gets into action RPGs, and some people are out and some people are in, and some people say you've disgraced Final Fantasy, and other people are just like, oh, this is the natural progression of the series, and everyone has a different opinion on it. But what about people that got in at like 13? You know, they have like the opposite effect. They go back to the old ones and they're like, wow, you know, this was before they could make it action. Like, to them, it's almost like a downgrade. You know, oh, they probably always wanted to make action RPGs, but this is back in the day when they were stuck making turn-based. Isn't that funny? How, like, that's like, they could look at it as the complete opposite. We look at it as they made turn-based up to a point, and then they had to make action RPGs because they had just made turn-based for too long. It was time for them to move on. Whereas people that got in late are more like, oh, they always wanted to make action RPGs, but back in the day, they had to make turn-based RPGs. So it's really just a, you know, you really, when you look at it from a different perspective, it's interesting. That's why I think, you know, although I'd love to have Final Fantasy be this series that's congruent all the way through, you really do just have to look at it with each individual game and not look at it as, you know, a game in a series, but more of just look at it as each individual game. Because that's kind of the spirit of Final Fantasy, is that every game is different. Even back Final Fantasy 1 versus Final Fantasy 2, like they really tried to make them stand out between each other. So, you know, and when I'm finished with Final Fantathon and I do like my big review of every game, that's the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to look at each individual game as just an individual game and not as a Final Fantasy, you know. Because that's the only fair way to do it. It's just not fair to be like, 13 is an action RPG, so it's not as much of a Final Fantasy as the rest, so 5 out of 10. Because some people started with 13. And to them, that is Final Fantasy, you know? So, as much as I would like to look at it as a pure Final Fantasy fan, it's just not fair. It's just not fair to everyone, you know? If I'm doing a non-biased review. If I'm doing a biased review, then yes. 13 was a bit of a, wow, this is different. But if you grew up with 13, it wouldn't feel different at all, so. I kind of have to keep that in mind. Now, I can still say, like, hey, it was very controversial to make this decision, and that can kind of go into the review, but I don't think I can just say it's an action RPG, so that gets points off. You know? Right? Because that's not fair. Now, what I can say is, like, it removes some very important aspects of what made Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. For example, the stats. The fact that this only has, like, 2 stats. Attack and magic. Like, that's definitely something to take into consideration. When I do a review of 16, I'm going to take into consideration the fact that most RPG mechanics are completely gone in the void, right? Like, that's fair to talk about. But I do want to be careful and not just say, like, well, it's not a turn-based RPG, therefore it gets points off for being not Final Fantasy-y, right? Because that's not fair to the people that were born in a year where Final Fantasy-y was action RPGs, right? That's just a boomer take, a retro Final Fantasy take. And I mean, sure, some people will say that's just being a true fan, but I don't know, man. Just because you played the first games in the series doesn't make you any better than people that played later games. You know? Are you a better Mario Galaxy fan if you played the original Mario on NES? Does that make you a better Mario fan? Like, you know, I don't want to have that. I don't want to have that outlook. I understand people that do, but I don't want to, at least for doing a non-biased review of all the games, I want to make sure I don't have that perspective. I want to put that to the side and be like, that's valid for those people, and maybe even for me, but for these reviews, I need to just kind of look at it as a video game, you know. And take into consideration the fact that it changed a lot, but not necessarily just gatekeep it. Because when a series changes, when Mario changed from a 2D platformer to a 3D platformer, that was a big change, and that's definitely part of the review. Like, hey, they changed a lot here. But you're not just going to say, well, real Mario fans like 2D Mario, so Mario 64 sucks. Because it's not a 2D Mario, and Mario is made to be 2D. You know, like that. Everyone would call you nuts for saying that. So in the same way, I can't just be like, well, Final Fantasy XI is an MMO, so bad game. The only difference is that, you know, Mario 64 wasn't called Mario Bros 4. That's kind of the only difference, and that's one of my big complaints, is that they continue to call them Final. I still stick by Final Fantasy XI should have been called Final Fantasy Online, because it was just so out there different. It was a completely different type of game. At least this is still a first-player experience, a one-player experience. It's just the mechanics are different. But an MMO is a completely different type of game. It's almost like if they called Final Fantasy Dissidia Final Fantasy XI. You know, I forget when Dissidia came out, but whatever number it would have been. You know, that everyone would be confused. Like, this is a fighting game. It's not a RPG, so that's kind of the only real big gripe is the naming. But that's the way they do it. I mean, that's, like I said, this is their flagship franchise. This is what makes them money, so they are going to continue to call them by their big numbers, because that's what makes money. But I do really think I would have had a better opinion of 11 if it was called Final Fantasy Online, and Final Fantasy 12 was called Final Fantasy 11. But then that brings into question, what about 16? Should that be called something else? Because it's really close to just not being an RPG at all. I don't know. But, yeah. I don't know where this whole huge rant came. I guess it's just because we've been talking a lot about 16 and the way the franchise is going. It's just, all this is on my mind, but... Yeah, but... Yeah. To be fair to 16, it really is Final Fantasy 16. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's... The story is very rooted in OG Final Fantasy. It's the mechanics that are like, wow, this isn't Final Fantasy, but everything else is Final Fantasy. So that's up to your interpretation as to whether or not you think that's enough for it to be called Final Fantasy 16. But yeah, that's the only real gripe, is the naming convention. Other than that, I think that it's really silly to just say it's a different style game, therefore bad. Because like I said, I mean, imagine if people said that about Mario. Imagine if people said that about Metroid. You know, Metroid, Super Metroid, and then Metroid Prime. Sure, it wasn't called Metroid 3 or 4 or whatever it would be at that point. But, you know, they turned it into an FPS. That's like the cardinal sin. You took a platformer and you turned it into an FPS? What are you thinking? And then Metroid Prime ends up being one of the best games ever made. Now, are you going to tell me if you watch a review of Metroid Prime and some guy is like, yeah, well, the last game was a platformer, and now this is an FPS? Wow. That's going to be 10 points off. Like, no one's going to say that, because Metroid Prime's incredible. So, no one's going to say that. It's its own thing, you know? So, that's the way I want to be when I review these games. If, you know, and I will submit the fact that, like, they're called Final Fantasy and then a number, and that's a bit misleading. But other than that, I'm not going to just say, well, it's not a turn-based RPG, so that's 5 points right off the top, you know, because that's just not fair. It's not fair to people that grew up with these games. And, you know, imagine the first game you played, the first RPG you played was Final Fantasy XIII. And then you have some guy going, well, it's not like Final Fantasy 1. You know, not everyone's not standing in a line waiting for their turn, so it's bad. It's just not fair. Anyways, now that I ranted for like 45 minutes, let me go get some coffee. To me, it's more about whether or not a game is good than what it's called. Yeah. I mean, at least when you're trying to give it a real bias look, you know. I think that what it's called matters, but maybe not as much as we sometimes make it out to be, you know? This is called Final Fantasy XIII, and it's a bit different than the games before it. That's a bit of a... You know, that's something to bring up, but it's not necessarily, you know, what really matters. Especially in a series like Final Fantasy where every game is so different. And Square has always been very upfront with that. Every game is going to be different. Different characters, different stories. I mean, if any series is going to have games that are vastly different, it's going to be Final Fantasy, right? If you're playing Call of Duty and at some point it randomly turns into a puzzle game, then maybe we're getting kind of weird. But with Final Fantasy, it's like you should almost expect it. And people like to point at Final Fantasy and say, well, the turn-based RPG is dead, but Square Enix is still making turn-based RPGs. Just not in Final Fantasy anymore. Final Fantasy is their series to innovate and do different things and experiment. Even when they make remakes, they innovate and do different things. I'm happy for it. We wouldn't have gotten Kingdom Hearts if it weren't for Square Enix always trying to do new things and innovate and be different. Imagine if Kingdom Hearts was a turn-based RPG. Imagine if they made Kingdom Hearts. They met with Disney and they were like, we're going to do this Kingdom Hearts thing, but then they were like, well, we have to make it a turn-based RPG. We're the turn-based RPG guys. Think it could have been good? Maybe. Maybe it could have been good. Maybe there's a world where we had turn-based Kingdom Hearts and it was like the best series ever. Kind of reminds me of the Mario Rabbids series. That are like tactical RPGs, or strategy RPGs, whatever you call them. SRPGs. Yeah, I was really upset with Square Enix when they came out and said, like, turn-based RPGs suck. When people were asking them about the remake, and there was some really weird takes, but luckily it seems like they've walked that back now, because they're making more and more turn-based, or at least publishing more and more turn-based games. I think they just had a weird idea of where the gaming industry was going. They had like a weird, well, no, that's not exactly what they said. They said something like, they had asked them like, why didn't you make the remake? This was back when the remake was like first truly announced, and they were like, why didn't you make it a turn-based? And they were like, turn-based games are out of date. Or something. They said something like that. Like, they said something that was genuinely negative about turn-based RPGs. And I was so upset because I was like, bro, you're making turn-based RPGs. Like, even if you don't want the remake to be a turn-based RPG, you can't say that about, like, you are actively publishing turn-based RPGs. But I think what they meant more was like it was a bad choice for the remake. And I think they had a weird idea of where the gaming industry was going. They had this weird, like, weird thought that, like, turn-based RPGs were dying, like, completely, and couldn't be further from the truth. Like, turn-based RPGs are much like platformers, where they're just so ingrained in video game history and the industry that they're never truly going to go away. They span from so many different things, like tabletop games, and, you know, the original turn-based RPGs were basically their attempt to make tabletop RPGs, tabletop games, into video games. That was the original idea. That's why a lot of them had you know, Dungeons and Dragons-esque characters and enemies and classes because they were trying to capture the magic of tabletop games. So, I mean, look at tabletop games. They've gotten nothing but more popular over the past 2 decades. You know, they went from a super duper niche that would only be in people's basements to giant podcasts about tabletop RPGs and movies about tabletop RPGs and stuff, you know? So if tabletop RPGs have gotten nothing but more popular, obviously turn-based RPGs are going nowhere. I think I maxed out everything on here. So I think they just had a weird thought process, and obviously they walked it back because they continue to publish turn-based RPGs. They continue to take them pretty seriously, just not in this series, but... Well, I mean, to be fair, Ever Crisis is coming out, and that's a turn-based RPG, but... Is it, though? Is it a turn-based RPG? I don't know. It's a turn-based mobile game. It's a gacha RPG. I don't know, man. Everyone wants me to be excited for Ever Crisis, but I don't know. I guess we'll see. I'm definitely not there. I remember when the remake was coming out, and people are trying to make arguments for and against turn-based RPGs, and everyone just went like, Persona 5! Like they they had like a curtain with like a little pool, and they were like, whoosh, Persona 5! It's like Persona 5 like absolutely just killed it. Just, I mean, holy cow, Persona 5. And a lot of people also like to mention Pokemon being like the biggest series ever, and it's all turn-based RPGs. Imagine saying that turn-based RPGs are out of date in a world where Pokemon exists. Holy cow. Like, my son has Pikachu pajamas. This is the world we live in.
Just stay out of my way.
You have Pikachu pajamas too? Nice. I need some Pikachu pajamas. Is there any reason to use Ruin? It does like the same amount of damage, even though it's magic and I have no magic. Your son started collecting Pokemon cards? Don't let him talk to Snipes. Serious. Keep him away. It's gonna be a bad influence. He's gonna be like that uncle that every time he sees him, he like slips him a pack. Do you get full HP after every fight, don't you? That's kind of, man. I really forgot how modern RPG this game truly is. I don't like that very much because I always really liked the style of RPG, and I'm not talking just retro RPGs, I'm talking about even modern RPGs. I like when dungeons are kind of about sustainability. Being able to get through the whole dungeon without running out of resources. And a lot of newer RPGs totally get rid of that mechanic. It's just kind of a shame, so I think that's what made some old RPGs really fun. That was one of the best things about Final Fantasy I, actually. How expensive items are, so you like cherish every single item, and how long the dungeons can be with no saves or heals. It always made it super exciting to go through dungeons, because you're like, oh my god, I don't want to die now. It gives you that feeling of, you know, I don't want to die, I don't want to get punished and have to do this part again. That thing that everyone loves so much about Souls games. But, you know, a lot of these newer RPGs don't have that. And I know I said I like the retry mechanic, but I've played retry mechanics where it still puts you at the same health. I'm trying to think of an example. What's an example of an RPG that has a retry mechanic but puts you at the same health? I know there's one that we've played recently. So like you can retry, but if you're kind of in a point where you're stuck, then you have to load. So you have a save before the dungeon, and then during the dungeon, if you die, you don't have to do the entire dungeon over again. But if you're kind of stuck or too weak, or you get soft locked to the point where like your retry point has you at 10 HP with no potions, then you have to load and try the dungeon again. I feel like that's a really good middle ground, where it doesn't feel super punishing, but at the same time, you have to be prepared. I feel like that's the best way to do it. I feel like that's the best modern way to do it. Because a lot of people don't like, you know, it's kind of hard for them to play like Final Fantasy I and play through a dungeon for an hour and then die and have to play the whole thing over again. That's one thing with modern games that people struggle with when playing retro games is there's so many games to play that they don't want to play through the same dungeon twice. So if they spend an hour in a dungeon and die, they're just like, you know what, I'll play something else. They don't have that same thing that we had as kids where this was pretty much our only game and we're just going to play it regardless of how many times we die. They'll just play something else. So, you know, having that ability to retry, but maybe not, you know, still make sure that people are actually ready for the dungeon or else they get punished. Like, I think that's a good middle ground. That way people can still fail, because failing is such an important part of games. And I talked about this with 16 too. Like, part of what makes video games great is failing. That's what makes video games good. You can't fail a movie. When you're watching a movie, the character always wins. You can't fail. I know sometimes there's bad endings, but, you know, for the most part, there's no adversity. You're just watching the movie and whatever happens is always what happens, right? That's what makes video games such a cool medium, is that you can fail. There can be adversity. You can get to the point where you feel like, I can't do this. And then through understanding the game or practicing or getting better, you can get over that adversity. And it gives the story a whole new meaning. Gives the game a whole new perspective where it's like, I did this, I practiced, and I was able to persevere, right? And that's a feeling you don't get out of many other mediums. You don't get that from movies. So, I think that's important. It's important to fail, or at least face adversity. And, you know, when a character in the game goes against adversity, and then you go through the same adversity, it really makes you connect with the character more. You know? Makes you feel like I went through that same adversity, and now we're both on the other side. How's it going, Ard? Yo, super secret. Thank you for the 32 months, by the way. Thank you very much, man. This guy just kind of, he likes to stand there and charge. He's charging up his laser. Doing good. Luckily, I do remember this game not being a walk in the park, but that's why I said I like games to be challenging but have a retry mechanic. I think that's a really good middle ground between retro games and modern games, where we can still have difficulty but we don't have to replay things, because replaying things is just not really something people like to do nowadays. You got the boomers like me who will retry a room for 9 hours straight in Celeste. But I can't expect everyone to be that way. Just because I like doing that doesn't mean everyone does. The difficulty in video games has always been a hot topic, because it fluctuates. There seems to always be... To me, it kind of feels like games get easier and easier and easier, and then one day someone just comes out with a hard game and everyone remembers, like, oh yeah, hard games. And then it just kind of repeats over and over. That's kind of how I feel. It fluctuates. What do you guys think about this newer style of modern game that we're starting to see now, where the first time through the game is like almost free, but then there's like some kind of super difficult bonus mode, new game plus, hard, whatever. Like, I kind of think of the remake. The remake was like not free by any means, especially the final boss, but I would not say the remake was a hard game. I would say it was pretty medium, even on the easier side. But then hard mode kicked most people's butts. So, you know, do you think that's good? Do you want more challenge on your first playthrough? Do you not want to have to play through the game twice at all and you just want it to be hard from the start? Because I know some people, like I think Marsh pretty often just picks hard on his first playthrough, so he doesn't have to play through the game twice. I prefer to always play games on normal the first time through, because I like to see how the developers balance the game on what they perceive to be the normal difficulty. And I always like to give myself the ability to play through a game twice, because part of my enjoyment of games is how much time I get out of them, so I like to be able to play through it twice. But, you know, games like the remake, they don't even give you the option. You don't have the option to play hard. You have to play through normal the first time, and then you get hard. So it kind of forces you to play through twice if you want to have any kind of real challenge. And I don't know if that's really the best way to go about it. like I said before, I think difficulty is part of the storytelling. That's my opinion. I think that a game being hard is part of what makes the storytelling interesting. And I've always thought that final bosses should always be incredibly difficult. If I were to make a game, I would make the final boss like almost on the level of Super Boss. Because I think that a final boss should be the ultimate test of everything you've learned. And beating the final boss, the reward is seeing the ending of the game. So I always felt like it should be a huge challenge. But that's just me. That's just my own, like, game development standpoint. I don't think it's necessarily the right way to do it, but that's just my personal... If I were to make a game, that's what I would do. Look at this hallway. Epic. Epic hallway. I think, well, NES games in general are pretty bad balanced. NES games are pretty poorly balanced for the most part because a lot of times their difficulty is just because there's lives. 9 times out of 10 an NES game is hard because there's lives and you have to restart the whole game if you lose, which is just not, like, even nowadays it just almost feels more unfair than fun. It depends on the game. Some games, your ability to get through the early part of the game gives you more ability to beat the game later. I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, like the original Mario, the better you play throughout it, the more lives you're going to have to try to beat the final stages. So, like, in a way, playing it over and over again, you get better and better at the beginning and you get more resources for the end. So, like, that kind of thing, I think works. I'm just gonna jump all the way down. Oh, okay. You just broke your legs. But then there's games where it's like, you just have to play the easy first level over and over again because you keep losing to the unfair boss at the end of stage 3, you know? So, it depends on the game, but a lot of NES games are kind of poorly balanced in that way. A lot of it was, we don't have much space on this cartridge, but we want them to play this for more than 10 hours. So let's just give them 3 lives. A lot of it was not the way they wanted to make it, but it was more a necessary evil because of the technology. DMC3, yeah. But don't get me wrong, there are NES games that are just straight up hard. Like, give you infinite continues and they are straight up hard. And yeah, some of them are well balanced, some of them are not. Some of them have a really hard final boss. Some of them, the whole game is just unfair. Some kind of stupid mechanic like enemies spawning or... beginner traps. Freaking Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on NES. Deploys like some of the most ridiculous tactics to get you to game over. Frickin', oh my god, don't even bring up Dragon's Lair.
You gotta stop worrying, Sass.
Frickin' Ghosts and Goblins. Oh, you beat the game? Beat it again. Yo, gamer guy, thank you so much for the 9 months, man. Really appreciate it. Welcome back. Hope you're doing well. Should probably be Libra-ing more things, huh? Battletoads.
Wow.
Stay close.
I want to look around.
Kids. And then Vanille died.
Over here!
It's funny too, like when we talk about difficulty, everyone has such widely differing opinions, and games are so different that it's hard to say really what the best choice is. Like, for example, most games, you would say like, oh, multiple difficulties is a great thing, right? For those that want a challenge, you can play hard. For those that want to just play the game, normal. For those that are new to games, easy. Like, that's good for everyone, right? There's no reason not to do it that way. But then, you look at a game like Dark Souls. If we put an easy mode in Dark Souls, I'm pretty sure there would be revolts. Like, people would be in the streets, fire in the streets. GameStops would, well, they'd probably be the same as they always are. Wow, that was a boss. Wait, is he dead? He's not dead.
It's charging up.
Yeah,
Charging? What are you talking about? Charging for what?
he's charging his phone.
Its last moments.
Did you hear about the new GameStop program? I got some email. They're changing the power-up rewards. Now it's like GameStop Pro or something. Like, this is your solution to fix GameStop. We're just gonna change the name of your rewards program for like the 19th time. That's their go-to every time. Every time GameStop's in trouble, they're just like, I know what we'll do. We'll just change the name of our rewards program. That'll solve everything. It does have easy mode. It's called using sorcery. You're not wrong. Especially in Elden Ring. Holy cow. I was shocked at how good sorcery was. Alright, good night. I'll wake you up again in 20 minutes when I have some other hot take about Dark Souls. I don't know, man. They've changed it so many times and it just is the same thing every time. I wish I could change... See, I kind of screwed up. I forgot to change paradigms so that lightning could be a Ravager. Also, I should be Libraing him. His weakness is arrow. Get him, Saz. Why does this guy have a rear mouth? I think they were trying to make a Yu-Gi-Oh card. This guy looks like a Yu-Gi-Oh card. Oh man, Arrow is just ripping him up. 2 stars. Synergist is available for size. Saboteur is not available for vanilla. I remember Saboteur being good. Monopolies are a wonderful thing.
Come on, hop to it. Let's go.
What if we found out that GameStop was run by Owaka the 23rd this whole time? Yo, I agree, Chrono.
This'll make things easier.
Yeah, knowing our luck, it's probably missing an engine.
You shouldn't be so negative.
And you shouldn't get your hopes up.
This music is incredibly unfitting. Okay, maybe not that unfitting, but it's just kind of goofy.